In this thrilling episode, the prophet Elisha takes center stage in a world of conflict and miracles. As the prophet's extraordinary power clashed with military events, we witness a captivating narrative of divine interventions, wartime strategies, and the unfolding of a remarkable legacy. Thank you for joining us again, brothers and sisters, and we are glad to have you. In our previous lesson, we encountered the story of Naaman, a man afflicted with leprosy who came to the prophet Elisha for healing. At first, Naaman was reluctant to follow Elisha's instructions, but after he obeyed and dipped in the Jordan River 7 times, his leprosy was miraculously cured. Naaman offered Elisha a reward, but Elisha refused to accept it. Later, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, pursued Naaman and dishonestly accepted gifts, leading to his own punishment with leprosy. The narrative then shifted to a group of students who studied under Elisha. When they sought to expand their school, Elisha joined them by the Jordan River, where they began cutting down timber. During this endeavor, one student's borrowed axe head fell into the river. However, Elisha miraculously caused the iron axe head to float, showing God's involvement even in seemingly minor aspects of life. This story teaches that God cares about the small details in our lives and demonstrates how faith and obedience can lead to miraculous outcomes. Just as the lost axe head was restored and made useful again, humanity lost in sin can be redeemed, given purpose and brought closer to God through Christ's suffering on the cross. This story emphasizes the profound significance of faith and obedience in our relationship with God and how He can elevate our lives beyond the mundane.
Today we would be meditating on 2 Kings chapter 6 verse 8 onwards. Now notice the situation. Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up my camp in such and such a place. The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there. Then in verse 10, so the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again Elisha warned the king, so that he was on his guard in such places. This enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, will you not tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? Verses 8 to 11 we just read. The king of Syria or Aram was disturbed, friends, because every plan he made and every place he wanted to go was discovered by the king of Israel. And therefore he came to a conclusion that there must be a spy in his camp. He called together his military and attempted to locate the traitor. Which one of you is for the king of Israel? He asked. Which one of you? Honestly, there was no one. All of them were actually very loyal to him. Verse 12, none of us, my lord the king, said one of his officers, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. The prophet Elisha had bugged even the bedroom of the king of Syria and knew everything he said. And the way he bugged in that day was that the Lord revealed it to him. So the king of Syria decided on one plan of action. Plan elimination. Eliminate Elisha. He sent out those to spy out where Elisha was, and they located him in Dothan. Dothan is a place very north of Jerusalem, about 60 miles away from Jerusalem. Now, verse 16, "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And I want to tell you that seemed rather unrealistic, because here were the hosts of Syria, the whole entire army of Aram of Syria outside, and Elisha was very much alone with his servant. And that servant was obviously frightened to death. So Elisha prayed, and his prayer is interesting. Notice verse 17. "And Elisha prayed, 'O Lord, open his eyes so he may see.'" Now wonder the amazing truth of the next few words. "Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots, chariots of fire all around Elisha." The question now arises, is this the stated policy of God in dealing with his own? Psalm 91 says, "He will command his angels to watch over you." That's what God does to each of us. Angels, God's angels, are watching over us. Just as they did for Elisha, he is the same God today. But for this provision of God, many things could have happened in our lives. Isn't he a wonderful God? Isn't he such a beautiful God? Doesn't he deserve our complete, unreserved worship? Verse 18. "As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, 'Strike these people with blindness.' So he struck them with blindness, as Elisha had asked." Elisha did a very unusual thing, you notice. He asked God to smite the entire army, the hosts of the Syrians, with blindness. And what did God do? He did just that. Isn't this amazing, friends? When you ask by faith, God will do it. Then Elisha led them all the way into Samaria and told them that he was leading them where Elisha was. When they got to Samaria, he turned them over to the king of Samaria. The king wanted to slay them, but Elisha said, "Don't do that. Feed them and send them home." Grace in the midst of wrath. Verse 23. "So he prepared a great feast for them, and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory," a landmark event in the history of this nation Israel. Friends, both the power and the graciousness of Israel's God, as represented by Elisha, must have really shaken the Syrian king. He abandoned his war, his constant, unrelenting war against Israel. However, at a later date, Ben-Hadad, this is by the way a title rather than a name, again began to besiege Samaria, as we shall see in the next episode. In this episode, verse 24 onwards, it speaks about how Ben-Hadad besieges Samaria. Sometime later, verse 24, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army marched up and laid siege of Samaria. There was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, a donkey's head, and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. The famine was so severe, friends, you notice, that priceless things, simple things, ordinary things was priced at a very, very high rate. They were really having inflation, this land. Now verse 31, he said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." We don't know why the king considered Elisha as responsible for the horrors of the siege. Probably, he thought, it was in Elisha's power to provide food in a miraculous way and was going to execute him because he did not provide that food. This chapter 7 continues the narrative of chapter 6, holding Elisha responsible for the siege. The king of Israel sends an executioner to slay him. However, God forewarns his servant Elisha, gives him the good news that the famine will end on the very next day. Elisha said, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a sheah of flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 sheaves of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. A measure, a sheah is a measure of fine flour, which in the New Testament is referred to as a bushel." That means the inflation is now over. They would be having a real discount on flour. How could such a thing come to pass overnight? How could food be brought into the city when the Syrian army was camped outside the walls, allowing no one in or out? Apparently, friends, I believe that the king believed Elisha's audacious prophecy because he spared his life at this time. However, his right-hand man scoffed at this idea. Verse 2, the officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heavens." Could this happen? This prediction was literally fulfilled in the next day. Now the scene shifts to a pathetic group of hopeless men outside the city gates. But it is a wonderful miracle, nevertheless, friends. Now there were 4 men with leprosy, verse 3, and they were sitting at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why should we stay here until we die? If we say, 'We'll go into the city,' the famine is there and we will die. And if we stay here, we will also die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, we die." At dusk, these lepers got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, not one man was there. They entered the camp and not one man was there. Notice the discussion between and among these lepers. They were excluded, remember, from the society. They were dependent upon relatives, upon friends, in bringing them food. Now that everyone inside the city was starving and there was no surplus, how could they have anything to eat, these lepers? The lepers, realizing that they had nothing to lose in such a context, decided to throw themselves upon the mercy of the enemy. When they reached the camp of the Syrians, amazing. They noticed and they discovered that it was deserted. What had happened to this great army? Probably 100,000 men or more. Verse 6, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and of horses and of a great army, so that they said to one another, look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us. So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and their donkeys. They left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. What an incident! The sound of an approaching army had put them in panic. The Syrians did not march in an orderly way. When they took off, it was every man for himself. They were traveling at night, and they were also traveling very, very fast. Verse 8, the men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp and entered one of the tents. You notice. They ate and drank and carried away silver and gold and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent, took some things from that tent and hid them also. In that day the army, friends, what we see in verse 8 of 2 Kings chapter 7, is that in that day the army carried with it all the food they would need. This was a long campaign. They were besieging Samaria, the city there situated on the top of a hill. In their scramble to get away, they left everything, all the supplies that they had. And the Syrian army just immediately, suddenly fled. Notice what the lepers now do. They enter the camp and they eat like men who have not eaten for days. Then they found and hid some gold and silver that they would never have any need of. Verse 9, then they said to one another, notice the conscience of the lepers. We are not doing right. This is a day of good news and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let us go at once and report this to the royal palace. Now the excitement of these lepers is all over and they begin to come to themselves. They begin to decide that they must take this good news of this empty Syrian camp to the king. Chapter 8 now. The people of Israel soon forgot God's miraculous deliverance and returned to their sin. So again, they suffered the judgment of God in the form of a famine. Verse 1. Now Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, go away with your family and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years. The woman then proceeded to do as the man of God had said. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines 7 years. Verse 3, at the end of the 7 years she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to the king to beg for her house and her land. In the meantime, as we notice in the first 3 verses, her land had been taken over by somebody else. In verse 4, the king was talking at this time to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and he said, tell me about all the great things the prophet Elisha has done. Just as Gehazi was telling the king about Elisha, how he had restored the dead to life, the woman whose son Elisha had brought back to life came to beg the king for her house and her land. At the same instance, Gehazi said, this is the woman, my lord the king, and this is her son. whom Elisha restored to life. The king asked the woman about it, and she told him. Then he makes a very interesting decree. Then he assigned an official to her case, one official, exclusively for the woman's case. And he said, give back everything that belonged to her, including all her income from her land, from the day she left the country until now. Can you imagine God's mysterious ways? When the famine was over, we see that the Shunammite woman returned to a former home. Others, she found, were living in her land. At the same time, in God's perfect providence, the king in a different place was inquiring about some of the lesser known acts of the prophet Elisha. And Gehazi was telling him about Elisha raising this woman, the Shunammite woman's son, from the dead. The king then made a ruling that her property was to be restored. All her property, as well as the fruit of her land. Remember, friends, we worship a transcendent God. He is greater than the sum of all our confusions. As Elisha experienced in his life, he tasted, because he tested, the full capacity of this great God. Don't be a 6-inch believer. Trust God completely.
In 2 Kings 6, the king of Aram's incompetence stands in stark contrast to the power of the Lord's prophet, echoing a recurring theological theme in the Old Testament. This theme is exemplified in Psalm 2, where the Lord ridicules the nation's futile plots against him and his anointed king, exposing their misunderstanding of his knowledge and sovereign might. This theme also appears in Psalm 59 verse 8 and 2 Kings 19, where the nations mistakenly believe they can act with impunity. In Isaiah 40, the Lord's omnipotence is juxtaposed with the nation's feeble attempts to oppose him. In 2 Kings chapter 6, Aram becomes a target of this theme as they challenge the Lord's power and fail. The Lord, through his prophet, humiliates Aram, forcing them to recognize his authority. Additionally, this exploration emphasizes that the Lord's sovereignty extends to his intimate care for individuals, seen in 2 Kings 6, small yet significant story of the recovered exet and the tender shepherd imagery in Isaiah chapter 40. While 1 and 2 Kings often focus on national events, they also acknowledge the Lord's intimate care in everyday lives through the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. Demonstrate these through life-giving interventions, challenges to injustice, purification of water, healing of poisoned food, multiplication of food, etc. This care extends even in times of national crisis, as seen in Jeremiah. In both grand and intimate contexts, the Lord's sovereign power is ever present. May God bless you.